This is our first time meeting, and we figured we would live stream our conversation about theory of racelessness. Feel free to sound off in the chat box and let us know if you have any questions for us, and we'll try to get to them before we end our conversation. Okay, Janay, I'm so excited to have you on Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason. We've communicated through email a couple of times about theory of racelessness, and you expressed interest in learning more. And I figured, why not share this conversation? Because I'm sure any questions you have or anything that you agree or disagree with, other people share the same questions and ideas in many ways. So I just want to invite you to introduce yourself however you feel so inspired, and then we'll get to talking.
Sure. So yes, my name is Janay Greene. I am a Master of Public Policy student at Temple University, and I'll be graduating this spring. So interested to be talking with you today.
Temple. That was a school I looked at actually for graduate studies. So
really?
Yes, ma'am. I'm gonna live vicariously through you since you're finishing up there. Do you live in Philly?
I mean, I live there right now for school, but I'm actually from Maryland.
Oh, what part of Maryland?
Anne Arundel County.
Okay, I was in PG County for a long time. I lived in DC when I was at Howard, but then I lived in Greenbelt. I met my spouse. We lived in Greenbelt, then we lived in Dundalk, then we lived in Reisterstown. So all over that part of Maryland. How do you like it in Philly compared to Maryland?
It's a change of scenery because I'm from like small town suburb type of area, and Philly is like a city, so definitely change of scenery, but it's cool.
Do you find yourself to be a more of a city person, or do you prefer the sort of small town feel?
That's a good question. Honestly, I feel like I'm open to whatever. I don't feel like I'm attached to either one. I'm used to Maryland, obviously, because that's where I'm from, but the city is cool too.
Yeah, I feel like that's the best place to be in as a young adult. I've lived in something like 6 different states and just never felt super attached to a place. And if there was an opportunity that arose that was attractive, I was like, yeah, I'll do it. It's a good place to be in. What do you intend to do after you graduate?
That is a good question. Obviously, I'm still figuring that out because I feel like some people have a dream job, but I don't necessarily have a dream job. I just want to be in an environment that works for me and I can do the type of things I'm passionate about. So
yeah,
happens, but obviously something policy related. I did do my bachelor's in history, so I still have a passion for that. So if I can incorporate my passion for history and also policy into whatever it is I do, then that would be great.
Well, I'm gonna put in all the positive energy and vibes into the universe with the hopes that you find exactly what you're hoping for. I think it's really important that if we have to spend a fair amount of our lives working, that it be something that we're passionate about and something that we're really happy doing. So I really hope that for you.
Yes, thank you.
You're so welcome. Remind me again, how did you come into contact with my theory?
Yeah, so I wrote a paper for my police, prisons, and pollution course, and I titled it Race Genealogy and the Abolition of Carceral Geography. I think that's what I called it. And like when I get stuff like in my newsfeed, obviously that can be distracting, so I just kind of save it to my computer. And I actually had saved your article before I wrote the paper, but I didn't read it till after I had actually wrote the paper. And I was like, wow, okay. Like it was interesting. One thing in the article you said that I thought was interesting. I was like, okay, I never thought of it like that. You said race is not a social construction. I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting because usually you hear race is social construct. And I did say race is a social construct in my paper, but you said it isn't. So I thought that was interesting. So that's one thing I'd like to hear you talk about a little more.
Yeah. What do you remember? Was it the Journal of Free Black Thought or was it the Newsweek article?
It was the Newsweek.
Okay. Yeah. It's funny because I feel like too many people miss that aspect of what I'm saying, because they want me to be saying what they already believe, but really I'm just like, you're all wrong. So that's actually one of the tenets of my theory of racistness. The first tenet is race is not biological, and the second is race is not a social construction. And that's a very radical and unusual thing for a person to say. And what I mean by that is, by my identification, what people identify as race or racial, they're misnaming other things, including racism itself. So they're misnaming culture or ethnicity. Ethnicity includes things like phenotype, how a person looks, ancestry, DNA. Ethnicity also can include culture, right? But I still like to parse them as separate things. Or they're misnaming class, because we know that concepts of race often get conflated with class, particularly Blackness gets conflated with poverty. And in that way, they're also allowing racism to hide its face as race, where we have problems of essentialization and stereotyping and actual racist ideas about particularly Black people, hiding itself as race. So in that way, I identify race as not actually existing, but I recognize that people think it exists either in nature or as a construction, but that I view that as a sort of conceptual error because they're just misnaming these other things that do exist, like racism, namely, but then also all of these other things. So that's how I come to the position that race doesn't exist as a social construction. And just because people believe it does exist as a construction doesn't make it more real to me. I kind of think of it as an analogy along the lines of atheism. An atheist doesn't believe more in a deity just because they see everyone else believing in a deity. They see churches, they see synagogues, they see, all of the tradition and holidays and all of that fanfare that comes along with the religion. That doesn't make God exist more for an atheist. And so recently someone coined the term ratheist or race atheist. But really it's just called skepticism. It's something called racial skepticism, which is outside the confines of viewing race as in nature and outside the confines of viewing race as a construction.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's seldom taught and commonly misunderstood, I would say, when true skepticism does appear, because you mentioned talking about race as a social construction, and in your prior papers, I end up making the case that constructionist positions of race are the default position in American society. So we're really taught and primed to see race as existing in some way, and that is part of the machinery of what allows racism to continue to exist. But if we make the radical act of acknowledging its non-existence truly, then we can start to transcend the problem of racism and stop reifying it intentionally or otherwise. And part of this radical identification of the non-existence of race means that when you call yourself a constructionist and you say things to the effect of race isn't real, it's misleading, because constructionists still believe that race is real. They just recognize often that it's not real in nature, but they feel like it's still a real phenomenon. Like there's still something real that people can coalesce around. So it's misleading. And I point to that as one of the shortcomings of constructionist positions, because again, it's a sort of mixed signals thing. If you say race isn't real, then you have to say how it's not real. And if you're a constructionist, that means it is real to you in some way. And so thinking through, like, what does it mean for it to be real? And then the last thing I'll say too about the constructionism is, ultimately what I'm advocating for is something called eliminativism, which speaks to what I think should be done with the concept of race. Many constructionists are primed to be reconstructionists. So the eliminativist aspect is also a radical position to have and share with people. And constructionists can absolutely be eliminativists, because the skepticism part isn't a prerequisite for saying, hey, to undo racism, we actually have to undo the belief in race. Constructionists can get there. It's just a matter of getting more clear that that's what's necessary.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree. You have to undo race first because that's the root, right? So going off what you just said, how do you feel about the idea of people being transracial? Because you just discussed race doesn't exist. So then, and then we had this idea of transracial that I've heard of. So what are your views on that?
What are your views on that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it's interesting that no, I think it's interesting because when you think about race and race not existing, then that would kind of mean that people who claim race, that means kind of like we're all living transracial lives, so to speak, if it doesn't exist, right? So
Yeah.
that was my thought.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, because I think, you know, to the extent that race could exist, or to the extent that people think that race exists, I would argue that all of us would then be mixed, right? There's no such thing as racial purity or cultural purity or anything like that. So I tend to think along the lines of Alain Locke, a really early example of a philosopher on race and culture, in the sense that race is a fallacy to some people's minds, just because of the fact that if we recognize how the world actually operates, everything is multi-directional and everything is indeed mixed. So in that sense, I view transracial as being a sort of, what's the word? As being kind of redundant in a way, because I already recognize the number one, the fallacy of race to begin with, and the fact that we're all, that would apply to all of us if we really understood what the thing is in the first place and didn't subscribe to the racist one drop rule and things of that nature. So I see transracialism as indicative of people who just haven't figured that out yet for themselves. In a weird way, it's like they have figured it out, but they haven't, because if they really figured it out, they would just say, you know, I'm raceless or aracial or something like that, or, you know, race is a fiction. And the unfortunate thing about the label and people embracing it as a thing is it upholds and naturalizes the existence of race, and specifically the black-white binary, which I think is, yeah, it's not going to get us to the solution, unfortunately.
Right. Okay. So we're gonna say something.
I was just going to ask you if you had heard, like in terms of transracial, I would guess that Rachel Dolezal would probably be spoken about as a sort of transracial person. I've also seen Ollie London on YouTube identify themselves as transracial, and that was like that was hugely problematic, because he basically called Korean a race, and it's not a race to most people's minds. And so it's just a lot of more questions than answers there. But can you think of any other examples of people claiming to be transracial?
No, I don't think I can think of any other ideas, honestly. I thought of that because I did mention, so I mentioned transracial in my paper in the beginning because one of my professors, one of my history professors actually had mentioned it in one of our course, in a course that I had with him. And he had posed a question like why are we so attached to race? And that's kind of why he brought up transracial to begin with. And I can't remember exactly what his argument was. I think he was just trying to play devil's advocate like some professors do. But I guess as I continued to listen to him, like it made me think like some people would say they don't feel a certain race, like, oh, I don't feel black, or I don't feel, and it's like, what does it mean to feel like you're black enough? People don't feel black. So when I thought about transracial, I was like, maybe this is what he was getting at by why do we care so much? So that's really why I posed the question, because that was like a time where I was like, that's a good question. Like, why do we care so much? So, yeah.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's like, on the one hand, many constructionists will say race isn't real, but then how we treat it, it's as if it is real and as if it is biological. And by extension, that lends to these instances of people saying that they are basically misraced in the public sphere, and they see themselves on the inside as being something that's not readily apparent to other people on the outside. And what does that mean? Um, and how have race and culture been conflated in ways that make them almost impossible to detangle? And what does that mean in the context of, trying to work against racism or trying to resolve issues caused by historical racism and all the things? Yeah, it's really a vicious cycle.
Mhm.
But I'm glad to hear people asking questions about it, because I don't think we're encouraged to ask questions.
Yeah, so another question I have would be like, because to be honest, I still identify as Black because it's like there's a lot of people, I mean, that's all I know, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, I recognize that it's kind of like, I'm more Janay. I would tell people, like, if someone says, who are you? I would say I'm Janay. I'm not going to say I'm Black. Maybe that'd be the second thing I say, but that's not going to be the first thing, So I recognize I'm more than Black, you know what I mean? So I recognize that. I still identify as Black, and obviously a lot of people do too. So the thing is, when you think about inequities and racial disparities, how could people go about tackling that without, that identity or that label of race? How can we tackle these social issues that are connected to a construction of race if we don't specify, like, how can we talk about it differently within the language? So solutions are still being made to solve problems.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that part of what's misleading about how we approach problems caused by racism, or how we approach racism, is the fact that because we hyper focus on the symptom, which is race, we fall into the trap of thinking that we're doing more against systemic problems than we actually are. And that's the unfortunate thing about it. Like, I watched Coleman Hughes's A Case for Colorblindness. I think that goes at least a couple years back, but I've watched it a couple of times and really grappled with what he was saying there and did some more research. But ultimately, at the core of what he explains is the policies that are race specific, they kind of trick us into thinking that we're doing something to solve racism. But if you look at the numbers, if you look at the data for Harvard, for example, and you look at the data for affirmative action, you come to see how people who are racialized as not white benefit from race specific policies, but that the people who benefit are largely middle class to upper class, sometimes immigrants who are middle to upper class. And so, but I think that because Blackness gets conflated with poverty, for example, we are tricked into thinking that those race specific policies are doing more than they actually are. And I think that means that we are bamboozled. I haven't used that word in a long time. I think that means we're bamboozled into thinking that we're making more headway in terms of what I see as a problem that needs tending to, such as impoverishment, our poor educational system, mass incarceration, all of those things. I think that we continue to make the mistake of being race specific as opposed to having more universal application and getting more creative with it, and recognizing that whatever policies we can enact or come up with can and probably should just help all incarcerated people, as opposed to a race specific incarceration group, or should help all impoverished people because they, based on their zip codes, they get access to schools that are trash, right? They are underfunded and underserved. And although racialized Black people are disproportionately impoverished in this country, if we look at the numbers, we come to recognize that the vast majority of racialized Black people are not impoverished, do not live below the poverty line. And what does that mean? What does it mean to want to fight against poverty, but to do it through race-specific language where you're including 80% of the population that doesn't even apply to, like poverty doesn't even apply to. So I think in terms of strategy, having a truly raceless approach to policy has proven to be more effective in the areas that we say we want to be effective in. And there are no examples that I can really think about where there's an exception. I'm open to being proven wrong. I'm open to being proven wrong. But I think that that's actually a good thing to know more statistics and more data, because then we can see like, okay, actually the ways that we conceive of racism, it's not necessarily always matching up to reality, which we should be applauding and patting ourselves on the back for, but we should focus more on class still. That being said, we should stop conflating race with class, and we should just focus on class, or we should and focusing on class, we should focus on the educational system. We should focus on better policing. We should focus on, Angela Davis's "Our Prisons Obsolete" was a really thought-provoking book for me. We should focus on our prison system and reimagining that and looking at other models or countries for examples on what that can look like. Mental health system is inadequate, which is part of what puts a lot of people in prison. So there are solutions, but I think that focusing on race-specific solutions is a misstep.
Yeah. I think focusing on classes could be like a good approach, because when you think about statistics, like say someone mentioned in public policy, like quantitative skills and like being good with numbers is important, but if you think about it, the numbers are incorrect anyway, because when you think about like for example, people who identify as Black, like people will try to tell you you're not Black, say if you're light skinned or something, like, or if you're like before, the one drop rule, if you have one drop of Black, you're Black. And now today, like people be like, you're not Black, you're biracial. So it's like, how accurate are the numbers anyway that we're looking at? So.
That's true. And that's an aspect I don't know if many people are really grappling with, because I think when people talk about statistics or polls as being inadequate, they're just thinking that the numbers are skewed somehow, like the government is deceiving us. It's a conspiracy, and so we're just not getting the real information. But I think what you're saying holds true for most methods of data collection, including the census. It's like, to my mind, the census isn't going to then check, okay, is this the actual salary range for the household? Is this, do the races hold up and all those things? It's like,
right.
It's like, so that's really true. And then add to that the fact that since most people view race as a social construction, they can sometimes treat it as a social construction. And you have people checking the box for white who other people wouldn't view as white, but they actually see themselves as white. Like that's a really good point.
Yeah.
It kind of encourages me to continue down the path of thinking about policy in a sort of raceless perspective, because if the outcome of that are ineffective policies, then it kind of keeps the status quo maintained in a lot of ways. And it also has the nefarious effect of upholding and naturalizing race, which means that racism continues to get perpetuated. And then never mind the fact that I think the data can be misleading just by nature of collecting data along so-called racial lines.
Right.
That's deep.
Yeah.
That's deep. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So also, Like I have been thinking about like genealogy, like since the start of the school year. I was just reflecting on things, and that was a word that was that came into my head. But I'm not a sciencey person, so when I thought it, I wasn't thinking genetics. When I thought genealogy, I was thinking like family history, family stories that you can connect to, like you can either hear about them or record them or whatever. So I one thing I was thinking was like if we're going to move in like this direction of a raceless society, then we should try to look at our families more so, look at identities through our families rather than our races. Because I'm more so the daughter of my mother and my father than I am a Black person. You know what I mean? Like it would make more sense for me to tell you who I am based on who I'm literally related to rather than people. Because like you know, I didn't meet you till today. Like, but I could tell you about my mom and my dad any day. So it's like that makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, I think it on some levels it definitely makes more sense than assigning value to being part of a so-called racial group. In my conversation recently with Coleman Hughes, he's talked about how if you're going to have race pride, this thing called race pride, then you have to embrace all of the evils of your self-perceived group and all of the
Mhm.
good too. But he said more often than not, it seems like people only want to take all of the good stuff, right, and kind
Yeah.
of sweep the rest of the rug. So I think looking to your family makes sense. And then I think it makes sense and certainly would be more helpful and fruitful and positive. But then at the same time, I also think about the ways in which that can also not be the case, if that makes sense. So my
Mhm.
example for me, I'm adopted.
Mhm.
My
Mhm.
biological parents are um they had many kids. They didn't finish high school, at least not that I know of. And two of my brothers died under suspicious circumstances in their care, so they were taken away by New York State and placed in foster care. And then when I came along, I was taken away immediately and placed up for adoption. I say all that to say that, oh, in addition to this, so my biological mother is on record as being in the dull IQ range, which
Mhm.
essentially means that she has some kind of mental disability, if you will. And in having conversations with her, that's readily apparent. And she tells me about it. She doesn't have a name or diagnosis that I remember her sharing with me, but I just remember she said that, she's always struggled.
Mhm.
And um, and then my adoptive parents, the irony is, to my knowledge, they both did finish high school, but my adoptive mother severely abused and neglected me. And so I ended up leaving that house on my 16th birthday and never looking back. And I have been left to wonder how I came out how I did, because based on both my biological family and my adoptive family, in so many countless and important ways, I'm the exact opposite um, of who they
Yeah.
are and who they stand for and the values that they hold. So
Mhm.
for me, I think aligning ourselves with each other based on our shared values would be the most fruitful way to do things, because at the end of the day,
Mhm.
we do have more in common than we have different. And we can get values from our families. In some ways, we can be taught how not to be from our families, like in my
Yeah.
instance. and so you and I might come from completely different families, but clearly we align in a lot of deep ways based on our shared values. And I think that would be a better way to think of ourselves. Like when I think of affinity groups, for example, right now we're doing the whole race specific affinity grouping and gender specific and sexuality specific and stuff like that. But I'm like, what would a world look like if we had affinity groups that were based on shared values or shared hobbies or something? Presumably, it would inspire more diversity within the groups. It would inspire more cohesion and collaboration and like cross interactions. that you don't necessarily get by proxy of focusing on phenotype and things like that. And that's the kind of world I want to live in. That's the kind of world I want to live in. But I'll say too, in terms of what you're saying about the importance and value of being able to think about your family and who you are in relationship with them, I think Ancestry, DNA, 23andMe, those kinds of things are a game changer to help us toward racelessness, because up until a certain point, people who look like you and I would fall back on the fact that we can't point to our ethnic origins, or we can't point to the origins of our familial ancestors because of the slave trade. But now we have these tests, which are accessible. I mean, $40-$50, something like that. And you can have your ethnicities mapped out for you. And if you're really interested, you can pursue doing research on any of the ethnicities that you feel inspired to know more about. So I think that can also help us toward racelessness too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Because, I think like when people talk about being mixed, it's like it can be taboo, but at the end of the day, we're all mixed up. And honestly, you don't even need a DNA test to tell you that, because most people already know what they're mixed with, because they'll tell you depending on the conversation. So, yeah.
It's funny.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say I think people should just celebrate all of who they are, not just one aspect. What sense does it make to know all these different things, but you're only claiming one? That doesn't make sense.
You're only claiming one, and you're translating it into race language, right? Like, my ancestry includes Nigeria, Benin, of course, that's Cameroon. It includes at least like 3 or 4 different countries in Africa. And then the average person will take that information and say, okay, I'm X% Black. And I'm like, why? Like the richness, the entire point of doing the test, to my mind, is lost, and opportunities are lost, because if some people are mourning the loss of being connected to the continent of Africa, for example, then that's a way to reconnect. But then it kind of, to me, is diminished if we just take that and translate it into race ideology. Because as you said, it's like people tend to want to claim one thing more than the other, if at all. And I would say too, it's beautiful to hear you think out loud, because I think people take for granted that only a person like me with lighter skin is mixed, right? Like that would be the general presumption. People automatically, I know people who look like me and who, for all intents and purposes, aren't considered mixed, but has lighter skin than I am, right? And I'm just convinced that one of their parents looks like fill in the blank, right? And then I meet the parents, I meet the grandparents, I meet the great grandparents, and I'm like, where's the person? Like, where is it? Like, how do you look like that? And that's the complexity of just human DNA and how our genes get expressed. But people take that for granted. And then people would look at someone like my wife, for example, who has darker skin than I, and presume that there's no mixing. But of course she has some mixed heritage. Look, I got my pick in my hand. Of course she's got some mixed heritage and stuff going on, because as you said, thanks to globalization, thanks to the Middle Passage, I think it's more often the case than not that people would come to find that they are ethnically mixed across the board. And that's a beautiful thing. Like, that shouldn't be something we're sad about.
Yeah, for sure. I just had a thought. I think that I just had the thought. Like, okay, I got it back. Like, we're taught that, people didn't identify themselves as Black or white or whatever else initially. So if that's not how it was initially, why are we okay with doing it still? You know what I mean? Like if if we already know that we didn't claim ourselves as this, why continue to claim it, you know?
Yeah, in some places on the continent of Africa did use the term Black to describe themselves, but it just didn't carry all of the baggage and the racist history because this was before colonization and all the things, right? So when it gets transferred over to the American context, and they're like, okay, indigenous and African peoples are enslaved, many of them, not all. And so we have to take this concept of race, which really used to refer to ethnicity and class in early modern Europe, and we have to change the language to shape it to reflect what's happening here and to keep the power imbalance as it was. So they didn't necessarily see Africans and indigenous people as automatically inferior. They saw a practical opportunity to enslave these people because it was more practical than continuing to enslave themselves and each other. So they saw the political and economic opportunity, and then they take the concept of race and the language that we now associate with race, and they married the two, and they created their race to reflect the caste system. So if you were racialized white, then you didn't always own slaves, because we know that's a fiction, but you were definitely not enslaved anymore. And if you were racialized Black, you were enslaved. If you were racialized as a person of color, you were free. There was always still a threat of being captured and sold and brought into slavery, but you had the privileges afforded to racialized white people. So it was really that category of Blackness that reflected enslavement and inhumanity. Because if you were enslaved, you were treated and thought of as property, right? And so initially, certainly people, even if they had a conception of Black or Blackness from one of the countries in Africa, that didn't carry with it the hierarchy, and it didn't speak to their cultural practices or the ethnicities or anything. It was just like, we look like Black people in a way, not literally Black,
Yeah.
but that was the word that they used, right? But then it gets co-opted and fashioned in a way that's so pernicious, inflicted so much literal violence onto people. And then you have generations of people born into that system of racialization and racism and enslavement. And so while those people didn't see themselves outside of humanity, because they saw themselves as human, they saw the irony of the system, the peculiar institution of slavery, they still were born into the language. So they did embrace the category of Blackness, but they tried to write humanity into it. And that to me is, it was necessary because, abolition happens, Jim Crow happens, and then civil rights happen.
Right.
So it was necessary, but that's part of my evidence for how Reconstruction, continuing to try to reconstruct racism, because that's how I interpret trying to reconstruct race, is like, we're just trying to reconstruct racism. That's part of my evidence for how it's taken us as far as it can, because we've been reconstructing it for centuries. But because racism and the practice of enslavement created the language that we now associate with race, that's why we can't get outside of it, because race is the hierarchy. It's carrying the hierarchy. And that's why it's, to my mind, it's a mistake to continue to conflate everything good, like culture, ethnicity, class, etc., with race, because then it allows the hierarchy to continue to be, obscured, and we just need to throw it away. We need to throw it away. Nothing positive about being racialized. There's nothing
I'm
positive.
glad you explained that. That's good. That's good how you showed your evidence in there. I like that. So yeah,
I'll send you my book when it comes out. I'm thinking.
Okay.
I'm thinking. The publisher said expected to take about 5 months once it gets to the production phase, which it finally reached. So they're telling me by summer. So whenever it comes out, I'll ask for your mailing address and I'll send it to you.
Okay, I have 2 questions. I'm gonna ask this one first.
Yeah.
So you're in literature, you're a professor of literature?
That's right. Correct? Mhm.
You're within the African American Studies department?
I'm actually in the English department,
English, okay.
but I specialize in African American, Caribbean, and American literature. And my classes are cross-listed in Africana and Latinx studies.
Got you. So, like, what do you teach in your courses, like, in respect to like your theory of voicelessness? Like, how do you teach your students about these, diverse literatures in relation to your theory?
Oh, thank you for this question. That's awesome that you're even thinking of that. So I teach the philosophies of race up front,
Mm-hmm.
which means I teach all of them. I go through the 6 categories. I give them readings that explain the categories. I've been using a draft of my first chapter for my book, which synthesizes the philosophies and the history. So that's been
Mm-hmm.
really helpful, and it's been a good tool. So they can really engage with upfront. Hey, these are the philosophies that were most commonly taught, and
Mm-hmm.
these are some alternative philosophies, and then they can explore the literature through a more expanded view. And then we look at the literature and we try to identify, okay, what might the writer's philosophies be? What might the character's philosophies be? How is race performing in the text? And how is racism masquerading there? Or is it
Mm-hmm.
sometimes culture that we're seeing, but it's being identified through race language and all of that? So that's how I approach it. And let's see, in terms of like class titles and stuff, last semester I taught a Harlem Renaissance class and modern Black literature class. I didn't title the classes, just FYI. This semester I'm teaching creolization in literature, which is fun because I'm teaching philosophies of culture, specifically West Indian and Caribbean philosophies of creolization. And then we're going to examine the literature. And I'm also teaching post-colonial literature and culture. So you can imagine the philosophies of culture and race are going to be present for that class. I teach civil rights in its literature. Like I teach, I teach the breadth and depth of what would be considered Africana history and literature. And my classes are likely to be cross-listed also in philosophy because I am a philosopher really by accident. And my book is in a philosophy series. So, but that was really accidental. But I've come to see that as really central to helping students interrogate and question and oftentimes come to conclusions that they didn't necessarily have when they first entered the class about race.
Cool. Yeah, I think when it comes to race, it's interesting to see how race is viewed differently in different cultures and different geographies. So like
Yes.
America versus the Caribbean, or
Yes.
something else.
Sorry. Can you tell I'm enthusiastic? That's exactly
Yeah,
right. Yeah. Because
yeah,
I think we take for granted that it exists the same everywhere, and it just doesn't.
yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, so my professor that actually like brought up the transracial thing that I mentioned earlier, he actually is Caribbean, and I have some Caribbean
Oh,
background as well. So that's interesting. I know for the class I took with him, or one of the classes I took with him, I wrote a paper on one of Maurice Conde's books. You know
oh
her?
yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Conde.
yeah. I wrote on La Belle Creole,
Oh,
and I
nice.
was, yeah, she's tricky. I was like, I was struggling so hard to write that paper, but yeah, yeah, it's
I
interesting
to
to hear. Yeah.
I Tituba is one of my favorite books by Conde. Highly recommend that. I'm doing that in one of my classes this term, actually, which I'm
Okay. Yeah.
excited about.
I got the one that was most readily accessible, but the La Belle Creole is still good. But
That's
still,
awesome.
like, she definitely makes you think and question things because she never gives you the answers you want or that you were expecting. And I was like, okay, I
Amen.
can't say this.
Amen. Yes, I that's one aspect of Caribbean literature in particular that I just really love, like love. I don't know if you're familiar, if you've come across Edward Glissant yet, or Derek Walcott, or Kamal Brathwaite.
I've heard of Derek Walcott. I think I've read a couple journal articles of his.
I have some stuff to send you if you're interested, a recommended reading list, just because based on your interest and based on some of the ideas that you've expressed, there are some other writers and thinkers that I think you find like really fascinating and helpful.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I got a book by Kamaya Glover. It's called A Regarded Self that I started, but the semester has also began, so I
Yes.
can only do so much reading. But yeah, that's the book I want to get into because when I was doing my paper on Marie Kondo, I actually used her as one of my sources initially. So, and I thought the title itself is intriguing. So I look forward to diving into that more.
Nice. Yeah. No, I'm with you on there's only so much reading one can do. That's the struggle. I personally, I wish I could read more faster, but that's not how it works out.
Yeah, I'm definitely a slow reader for sure.
Did you have any other questions that you can think of?
Yeah, actually going to ask you, what do you think of the term people of color?
Uh, so anything that comes from racism, I have a point of contention with it. And so all of that language to me, Black, white, person of color, Asian, all of those terms to me, we need to undo them to undo racism. And person of color is definitely at the top of the list, because if you look at the legal history in American society and how person of color came into being and how it was codified in the law, then you come to recognize that to be a person of color in the early days, like even before America was America, it meant that you were of African or indigenous descent, but you were not a slave. That was a qualification. And to me, when things change and shift, and after Reconstruction, and person of color was a term used to describe people racialized as Black, primarily, along with Negro, all of that language and all of the efforts to reconstruct that language to be something that it was never intended to be, and to be something that it cannot be. I'm against, and I'm for just throwing it in the trash where it belongs, as a sort of historical term that we no longer use. One of my friends actually did a conversation on that term, and they were trying to decide, is it racist? And they were all agreeing that it is. That was pretty much the consensus, and that it washes over all of the differences between, because now when people say person of color, they're just meaning not white.
Exactly.
Right. And so what does it mean to always be sort of labeled and defined by what you're not?
Exactly.
And how does that privilege whiteness, and then it lumps everyone else together and all the things. So yeah, I it's challenging, because I work to avoid naturalizing race in the language. So I'll say like racialized Black, or not racialized as white, or racialized white, or racialized Asian. Sometimes I'll say racialized as a person of color to indicate the not white part. But I so look forward, Janay, to the day when I can just speak without having to use the language at all, and have people actually understand what I'm saying. I look forward to it.
Yeah, because person of color, like what you just said, is literally white people and then everyone else. And I'm like, it's so irritating, and it's kind of a political term too, because someone could be talking about someone who's racialized Black, but they'll say they're a person of color. I'm like, which category they're in, but you're generalizing them, and that's so irritating. So it kind of like takes away from actually dealing with those issues. So,
do you know, or do you meet a lot? I don't know how to quantify a lot, but do you have these conversations with other people in terms of what do they think about the term Black, or what do they think about the term white, or person of color? Like, are these conversations happening with your generation?
I've spoke to a couple people about person of color, because you could be talking we could be talking about police brutality and be talking specifically about a Black person, and a professor may say person of color. You can't do that. Like, let's specify. If we're going to talk about an issue, let's specify the issue. So that has come up because people try to generalize. And if we're going to talk about issue and try to really handle it and solve it, then we need to specify what it is we're talking about. So that term for sure has come up. But like an in-depth conversation like what me and you are having about, I haven't gone this deep with anyone. It's just been thoughts in my head. And then also I wrote it in my paper that I told you about. But other than that, I mean, I've talked to people about it, like, but people are like, yeah, I don't know if the world is ready for that. And I'm like, well, okay. So it's kind of like, but
Yeah.
I mean, you're ready for it. So it's definitely obviously people talking about it.
I'm ready for it. Listen, I'm so tired of hearing, I'll call an excuse that's going to come across as harsher than I'm really intending it, but I'm so tired of hearing the excuse of like, well, people are going to be against racelessness or whatever. People aren't going to want to let go of their race. So what you're saying is, so nobody should try, like nobody should share their knowledge and their insights to be the change that they want to see in the world because people aren't going to be open to it. How presumptive is that? And how pessimistic and cynical? And while I can appreciate the cynicism because of how racism has worked in our country and in many countries, I'm ever the optimist. Like I have overcome tremendous adversity. I've defied all of the odds and every statistic, and people would expect me to be more jaded or hardened because of what I've experienced. But instead, I'm like the exact opposite. I'm like, everything is possible. We can do this. I believe in the goodness of human beings. I do. I believe that good and love always wins. And I also believe that when confronted with evidence and given an alternative, I find people to be very reasonable. It's only the hardcore, nationalists or separatists across on either pole of the spectrum that will resist the words that I'm saying, but more people than not are open to it. And your generation and the younger generation, my students, my undergraduates, they're, at first they're like, oh, what is this? What is this? I'm like, listen, I understand. Nobody else is telling you this, right?
Yeah.
But by the third week, they're in and they can't go back to not knowing. They can't.
Yeah.
And that gives me hope.
For sure. Okay, I have one more question that just came to mind.
Sure.
What do you think about like there being a hierarchy within a particular race? Like, let me give you an example of what I mean. So I know one of my friends in the program that I'm in, something she said to me that really like stuck out to me in my head, that probably will always be in my head, is that she said, when you're Black people, everyone thinks you're African American, and she's Haitian. So it's like, what do you think about that? Like there possibly being like a hierarchy where African Americans may be treated better than other people who are racialized Black, but of different ethnicities.
Well, there's literature that suggests the opposite, actually, that people who immigrate or their parents did, they tend to do better economically. Like if you look at Nigerians who come over. So there's evidence, I think, to the contrary. But at the same time, I think in terms of what one could identify as intra-group hierarchy and fractures, I think that's absolutely a thing, even outside of that example. And actually, it's one of the primary reasons that I came into the work that I've been doing, because some people accuse me of being anti-Black and white supremacist and all this other stuff because they don't want to engage with my ideas. So they just throw the accusations. In fact, this is a fun fact. Let me share this with everyone. So this morning, somebody commented on one of my videos and said, quote, "Your entire video is horrible. Horrible history, horrible thinking skills, horrible everything," shaking my head. "Your thoughts on racism reeks of white supremacy and buffoonery. You shucking and jiving for the white man, LMAO. You the minstrel show of 2022. Again, your video and thoughts on race is deeply appalling and offensive. Take down the video." End
They
quote.
had time.
They had time. And guess who else has time? I have time. So those accusations, to me, are indicative of part of what I identified as intergroup fractures and the unintentional upholding of racism, which is ironic because they would say that I'm upholding racism. Not so. And it was my sincere love for people racialized as Black, because when I started this journey, I've gone through all the philosophies of race myself. For the most of my life, I was a constructionist, reconstructionist, because I didn't know of an alternative. And I didn't see an alternative as being necessary. So when I'm in that kind of philosophical headspace, I was looking at other people that I perceived as Black, and I was looking at the problems. And I was sincerely interested in identifying the source of the problems and solving the problems. And that's how I went down the rabbit hole of doing the research that I did and focusing on the bodies of literature that I did. And when I started to realize, wow, some of what I'm seeing here is that to undo racism, we have to undo race. It was a hard thing for me. I was like, I loved being Black. I didn't want to not be Black. I saw myself as a Black person, actually. And I was attaching everything positive I love about myself to my Blackness. And it took a long time. I fought my own ideas, Janay. I didn't want to be that Black person. And I didn't want to let go. And it took me a long time to just continue researching and thinking and researching and thinking and researching and thinking. And I couldn't unknow what I knew. And so I had to get to a place of embracing where my journey was taking me. And then I saw myself, I learned about the philosophies. I saw myself philosophically changing. And I just had to buckle up and hold on for the ride. And I did it from the sincerity of having thought differently, having lived accordingly, and having a deep and sincere love and desire to get the intragroup issues under control. It had absolutely nothing to do with racialized white people, had nothing to do with trying to help them feel better about themselves and less sad about being called racist. It literally had nothing to do with it. So when people come to me with that kind of venom and ad hominem, and they try to accuse me of centering this thing called whiteness, it's really ironic because I'm like, it was literally the opposite project. I centered Blackness first. And people underestimate how my work benefits people racialized as Black, because some people, at least initially, they don't really understand. But when you're in the group, when you're in the part of the intra group, right? And you live it and you see and you know countless people who think in various ways, and you see the irony of race ideology trying to wash over how we see ourselves and each other and all the things, and colorism and classism and feminism is another topic. But you see all of this, then you're like, oh, it's a no-brainer that there are hierarchies that are intra-group. But the good news is, I think once you can help people outside of the binary of Black and white and outside of racist ideology, I think a lot of that does fall away, or at least become more readily apparent and solvable, because we start to see how this talk of unity and solidarity is more a myth than its actual reality. It can be a reality if we actually want it, but the reality of solidarity and unification, I think, will shape shift once we transcend racism, and we'll start to see each other more clearly, which I think will be a really good thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Any other questions? You asked some like really excellent questions.
Thank you. I think that's all I have, honestly.
Awesome.
Probably could talk longer, but I know I gotta get off here soon. So
yes, well, I really appreciate you being open to streaming this conversation. I figure whatever questions and thoughts you have, other people might share in those questions and thoughts. And I hope this is the start of a new and growing connection and relationship. I'd love to read the paper you referenced. If you could email it to me, I would love to read it.
Yeah, for sure.
And let's just keep the door open and talk more.
Okay, cool. I will.
Thanks so much, Janay. I appreciate you. And thanks to anyone else listening. Welcome to Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason. Welcome to Theory of Racelessness. Subscribe, hit the like button, comment to help more people see videos like this and help assist this algorithm out. You know you want to. It's free. And if you want to support monetarily, you can also do that by becoming a Patreon. The link is in the description box. Until next time, be well, everyone.